We had to move forward, Mike. Richard Bonner said it like he was discussing the weather, leaning back in his leather chair while I stood there, still feeling the slight tremor in my left hand that reminded me every day of what 6 weeks in stroke recovery had cost me. My name is Mike Delaney. I'm 54 years old, and I'd been the senior plant operations engineer at Bonner Logistics in Dayton, Ohio for 28 years. Not the kind of man who made grand speeches or demanded the spotlight. Just the steady hand that kept a complex operation running smooth while everyone else worried about quarterly reports and efficiency metrics. I just nodded once, said understood, and started gathering my things from the desk I'd occupied since Clinton was president. The tremor in my hand made it harder to stack the technical manuals, but I managed. 28 years of institutional knowledge, of midnight calls when systems failed, of custom solutions that saved the company hundreds of thousands in downtime, reduced to a cardboard box and a handshake that felt more like a dismissal than a farewell. Richard had been more than just a boss for most of those years. When I started at Bonner Logistics back in 1996, fresh off a layoff from a dying manufacturing plant, he'd taken a chance on a guy with strong technical instincts, but no formal engineering degree. The logistics industry was changing fast. Automation was the future, and Richard needed someone who could bridge the gap between the old-school warehouse operations and the computer systems that were starting to run everything. I became that bridge. The plant I managed wasn't glamorous. We handled freight consolidation for manufacturers across the Midwest, moving everything from automotive parts to agricultural equipment through a complex network of conveyor systems, automated sorting platforms, and tracking databases that had evolved over 2 decades into something that worked perfectly, but looked like chaos to outsiders. I'd built most of it myself, piece by piece, system by system, learning as I went because that's what you did when budgets were tight and solutions needed to work yesterday. My wife Isabella used to joke that I loved those machines more than I loved her, but she understood. 26 years of marriage teaches you that some men show love by fixing things, by making sure the people who depend on them never have to worry about the complex systems that keep their world running. Our daughters, both grown now, with Emma finishing her master's degree in environmental science, had grown up hearing Daddy's phone ring at all hours because something at the plant needed attention that only I could provide. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in March. I was reviewing diagnostic reports from the weekend when the left side of my face went numb and the room started spinning. Isabella found me 20 minutes later slumped over my home office desk, drooling and unable to form coherent words. Minor stroke, the doctors called it. Could have been much worse. 6 weeks of rehabilitation, speech therapy, occupational therapy to retrain my fine motor skills. The tremor in my left hand was permanent, but manageable. My mind was sharp as ever. Just needed time to rebuild the pathways. During those 6 weeks, Richard called twice. First week to check on me, which I appreciated. 4th week to let me know Trevor would be helping out temporarily. Trevor Bonner, Richard's 29-year-old son with an MBA from Ohio State and exactly 0 experience in plant operations. Just helping out, Richard assured me. Just keeping things moving until I got back. When I returned to work on a Monday morning in May, Trevor was sitting at my desk, not using it temporarily, sitting there like he belonged there, reviewing reports on my computer with my coffee mug in his hand. The mug Isabella had given me 3 Christmases ago with "World's Most Patient Engineer" printed on the side. He looked up when I walked in, smiled like we were old friends, and said Richard wanted to see me in his office right away. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Richard couldn't quite meet my eyes when he delivered the news. The business had evolved during my absence, he explained. Trevor had implemented some efficiency improvements that were showing real results. The board was impressed with the cost savings and operational streamlining. We had to move forward, Mike, Richard said. And in that moment, I understood that my career at Bonner Logistics was over. I didn't argue. Didn't point out that I'd been the one who designed most of the systems Trevor was supposedly improving. Didn't mention that I'd taken calls from panicked supervisors during my recovery, because nobody else knew how to handle certain glitches that cropped up in our hybrid automation platform. Didn't remind Richard that I'd saved the company from bankruptcy twice in the early 2000s, when our main competitor tried to undercut us, and I managed to squeeze an extra 15% efficiency out of our sorting systems through custom programming that no consultant would have attempted. I just said I understood, shook his hand, and went back to clean out my desk while Trevor watched with barely concealed satisfaction. The plant floor veterans, guys like Jimmy Kowalski, who'd been running forklifts since before Trevor was born, just shook their heads when they saw me carrying boxes to my car. They knew what was happening, even if nobody was saying it out loud. The severance package was generous. I'll give Richard that. 6 months' pay plus health benefits, recognition of my years of service, and a glowing letter of recommendation that praised my technical expertise and dedication. What it didn't include was acknowledgement of the fact that I was the only person in the building who truly understood the automation platform that ran 80% of our operations. That platform was my masterpiece, built over 20 years of constant refinement and customization. It started as a standard warehouse management system, but I'd modified it so extensively that it barely resembled the original software. Custom Unix scripts handled the interfaces between different vendor systems, legacy mainframes from the 1990s talking to modern cloud-based tracking systems through API bridges I'd coded by hand when the vendors said integration was impossible. Proprietary algorithms optimized routing based on dozens of variables: package weight, dimensional characteristics, destination zip codes, carrier capacity constraints, seasonal shipping patterns, even weather data that predicted delays before they happened. Emergency protocols I'd developed after various crises over the years were documented in my head but nowhere else, because there'd never been time or budget for proper technical documentation. The system could process 50,000 packages per day with 99.7% accuracy, automatically adjusting for peak loads and equipment failures in ways that kept operations running when other facilities would have shut down. Trevor didn't know any of this because Trevor had never worked a day in operations. His MBA gave him theories about lean manufacturing and efficiency metrics. But theories don't help when the sorting system locks up at 2 a.m. and you've got $300,000 worth of time-sensitive shipments sitting in limbo. Those situations required institutional knowledge, the kind you only get from decades of troubleshooting in real-world conditions. I spent the first month of my involuntary retirement updating my resume and applying for positions at other logistics companies. The responses were polite but predictable. 54 years old with a recent medical episode wasn't exactly what hiring managers were looking for, especially when they could get 2 recent engineering graduates for what they'd pay me. I wasn't bitter about it, just realistic. The industry had changed, and maybe it was time for me to change with it. Isabella suggested I consider consulting work, maybe help smaller companies with automation projects that didn't require full-time commitment. The idea had merit. I'd kept detailed records of every major system modification over the years, stored securely at home because Richard had always encouraged engineers to maintain off-site backups for critical documentation. Those records represented 2 decades of hard-won solutions to problems that every logistics company faced eventually. The first call came 6 weeks after my termination. I was in my home workshop, rebuilding a carburetor for my 1967 Mustang, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. Voice message from someone named Derek at Midwest Freight Solutions, wondering if I might be interested in consulting on an automation upgrade project. Word was getting around that Mike Delaney was available, and apparently my reputation had survived my departure from Bonner Logistics. The second call came from Jimmy Kowalski on a Friday afternoon. He sounded worried, which was unusual for Jimmy. He'd seen everything in 30 years of warehouse work, and not much rattled him anymore. "Mike," he said quietly, like he didn't want anyone to overhear. "Things are getting weird around here. Trevor's been making changes to the systems, and some of the old protocols aren't running right. Yesterday we had a jam on line 3 that took 4 hours to clear because nobody knew how to reset the cascade properly. I asked him if Trevor had tried the standard restart sequence I'd documented in the operations manual. Jimmy laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "What operations manual?" he asked. Trevor said those old procedures were outdated, that the new efficiency protocols would handle everything automatically. Apparently, efficiency protocols don't know how to handle the quirks that develop in 20-year-old conveyor systems. The third call was from a vendor. Tom Martinez at Industrial Control Systems. Tom had been servicing our automation hardware for 15 years, and he'd always dealt directly with me because I was the one who understood the custom modifications we'd made to their standard equipment. He was calling to let me know that Trevor had contacted him about some performance issues, but Trevor didn't seem to understand the technical details well enough to explain what was actually happening. Tom asked if I might be willing to serve as a liaison, maybe help Trevor understand the system architecture so they could provide better support. I appreciated the gesture, but I told Tom that arrangement would need to come through official channels. I wasn't going to undermine Trevor, even if his inexperience was creating problems. Professional integrity matters, especially when nobody's watching. The calls kept coming over the next few weeks. Plant supervisors asking casual questions about procedures. Vendors confused by conflicting instructions from the new management. Even a few customers wondering about delays in their shipments. I fielded them all professionally, providing general guidance where I could while making it clear that I was no longer affiliated with Bonner Logistics. What I didn't do was reach out to Richard or Trevor directly. Pride, maybe, or just recognition that my time there was finished. I'd given that company the best years of my career, solved problems they didn't even know they had, and built systems that would outlast any individual employee. If they wanted to move forward without me, that was their choice to make. The crisis call came on a Friday evening in July. Isabella and I were on the back porch, grilling burgers and enjoying the first cool evening we'd had in weeks, when my phone rang with Trevor's number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something in my gut told me this wasn't a social call. Trevor's voice was shaky, almost panicked. "Mike," he said, "I need your help. The whole system's locked up and I can't get it back online. We've got 3 major shipments stuck in the sort matrix, and I don't know what to do." I asked him what had happened, trying to keep my voice calm and professional. He explained that they'd been running at maximum capacity all week, processing a backlog from some vendor delays, when the main sorting platform just stopped responding. All the status lights were green, but nothing was moving. The reset procedures he'd tried hadn't worked, and the system was showing error codes he didn't recognize. I knew exactly what had happened because I'd seen it twice before. Once in 2018 during a particularly busy holiday season, and again in 2020 when a vendor system update created unexpected data conflicts. The custom load balancing algorithms I'd written could handle normal traffic spikes, but under sustained maximum capacity with certain package mix ratios, a specific sequence of events could trigger what I called a cascade failure. The sorting matrix would lock all queues simultaneously to prevent data corruption, but the automatic recovery protocols couldn't restart because they weren't designed to handle the edge case scenario. The fix required manually accessing 3 subsystems through backdoor commands I'd programmed years earlier, clearing buffer queues in a precise sequence to prevent cascade restart failures, and temporarily modifying load parameters to account for the accumulated backlog. The entire procedure took about 40 minutes if you knew what you were doing, but it required understanding both the original vendor architecture and 20 years of my custom modifications. Trevor was nearly in tears when he asked if I could come in and help them get back online. $300,000 worth of time-sensitive freight was sitting motionless while customers called demanding updates. Richard had already fielded angry calls from 2 major clients threatening to take their business elsewhere if their shipments didn't move by Monday morning. I told Trevor I'd be there in 30 minutes. Isabella just nodded and handed me my keys. She'd been married to an engineer long enough to understand that some problems don't wait for convenient timing. The plant was eerily quiet when I arrived. Usually Friday evenings were controlled chaos, with multiple shifts overlapping to clear the week's backlog. Instead, I found a dozen frustrated employees standing around watching motionless conveyor belts while supervisors tried to figure out manual workarounds for shipments that needed to move immediately. Trevor met me at the entrance, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, trying to project competence, but his eyes told a different story. This was the first real crisis he'd faced, and theoretical knowledge from business school wasn't helping him solve practical problems that required hands-on experience. Richard was there too, standing near the main control station with his arms crossed and his jaw set tight. He nodded when he saw me, a gesture that carried more weight than any verbal greeting. We both understood that this wasn't about pride or personal relationships. This was about getting people back to work and keeping the company solvent. I walked directly to the control terminal and pulled up the diagnostic screens that showed the system's current state. The error logs confirmed what I'd suspected. Cascade failure triggered by sustained high-volume processing, with insufficient buffer clearing. What Trevor and his team couldn't have known was that the error codes they were seeing, EC4471, EC4472, and EC4475, weren't in any standard documentation because they were generated by my custom monitoring scripts. The automatic recovery protocols had attempted to restart the sorting matrix 6 times, but each attempt had failed because the underlying queue management was corrupted at the database level, something that required direct SQL commands to the buried tables that controlled package routing priorities. The fix took 43 minutes. I shut down the 3 critical subsystems in the precise sequence needed to prevent data corruption, manually cleared the buffer queues that were preventing restart, and modified the load balancing parameters to handle the current traffic volume. Throughout the process, a small crowd of plant workers gathered to watch, including several veterans who remembered the last time this had happened. When the sorting matrix came back online and the first packages started moving through the system, the relief in the room was palpable. Supervisors immediately began coordinating with their crews to process the backed-up shipments. Customer service started making calls to update delivery schedules. The familiar sounds of a functioning operation gradually replaced the tense silence that had dominated the building. Trevor thanked me repeatedly, his voice still shaking slightly from the stress of the previous few hours. Richard approached more cautiously, extending his hand with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. They both understood that this crisis had exposed a fundamental vulnerability in their operations, one that could have been avoided if institutional knowledge had been properly transferred instead of simply dismissed. Richard asked if I'd be willing to stay for a few hours to help them process the backlog and ensure the system remained stable. I agreed, but I made it clear that this was a one-time assistance, not a return to employment. I spent the rest of the evening monitoring the system performance and providing guidance to the supervisors who were handling the recovery process. Around midnight, as the last of the critical shipments cleared the sorting matrix, Richard asked if we could talk privately in his office. The conversation was awkward, but honest. He acknowledged that Trevor wasn't ready for the technical responsibilities of plant operations, and he asked if I'd consider returning in some capacity to provide oversight and training. I appreciated the offer, but I'd already made my decision during the 6 weeks of watching the company struggle without proper technical leadership. I was willing to provide consulting services when genuine emergencies arose, but I wasn't interested in returning to full-time employment. My stroke had reminded me that life was finite, and I wanted to spend my remaining productive years on my own terms. Instead, I suggested that Richard invest in proper technical documentation and cross-training for critical systems. The company had grown too dependent on individual knowledge holders, which created unnecessary risk when key personnel were unavailable. I offered to spend a few weeks creating comprehensive documentation for the automation platform, training existing staff on maintenance procedures, and establishing relationships with vendors who could provide ongoing support. Richard agreed to that arrangement, and Trevor, to his credit, participated fully in the training process. He'd learned a valuable lesson about the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical expertise. Over the following months, as I worked with their team to document and transfer critical knowledge, Trevor proved to be a capable student when he focused on learning rather than trying to prove himself. The consulting work that followed was more rewarding than I'd expected. Word spread through the logistics industry that Mike Delaney was available for automation projects, and I found myself working with companies across the Midwest on system upgrades and troubleshooting challenges. The work was intellectually stimulating without the political pressures and daily stress of full-time management. Emma finished her master's degree that fall and took a position with an environmental consulting firm in Columbus. During her graduation dinner, she mentioned that she'd always admired how I'd handled the situation at Bonner Logistics, maintaining my dignity and professionalism even when I was being treated unfairly. That meant more to me than any professional recognition I'd ever received. The following spring, I received a call from the Regional Logistics Association asking if I'd be interested in presenting at their annual conference about crisis management and institutional knowledge preservation. The presentation went well, and several attendees approached me afterward with consulting opportunities. I realized that my experience at Bonner Logistics, while painful at the time, had positioned me as an expert in exactly the kinds of challenges that many companies were facing as their veteran employees retired. Trevor called me one afternoon about 6 months after the crisis, not with a technical emergency, but to ask for career advice. He'd been promoted to a different role within the company, focused on customer relationships and business development rather than operations. The experience had taught him to recognize his strengths and limitations, and he was building a successful career in areas where his MBA training was actually relevant. Richard retired the following year and sold Bonner Logistics to a larger regional firm. The new owners retained most of the existing staff and continued using the documentation and procedures we developed during my consulting period. The automation platform I'd built over 20 years continued operating efficiently, now supported by a team of properly trained technicians who understood both the technical details and the business requirements. Sometimes I drive past the plant on my way to consulting jobs with other companies. The building looks the same from the outside, but I know the operation inside has evolved and improved. That's how it should be. Systems grow and change, but they need solid foundations built by people who understand both the technical requirements and the human elements that make everything work together. The stroke that nearly ended my career ultimately opened doors I hadn't expected. Consulting work allowed me to share knowledge gained over decades of problem solving while maintaining the flexibility to spend time with Isabella and watch Emma build her own career. The involuntary transition from employee to consultant had been painful, but it led to a more fulfilling and balanced approach to work that I might never have discovered otherwise. My left hand still trembles slightly when I'm tired, a permanent reminder of how quickly life can change. But that tremor also reminds me that expertise and institutional knowledge are valuable precisely because they're hard to replace. Companies that recognize and nurture that knowledge will always have advantages over those that treat experience as disposable. The most important lesson from that entire experience wasn't about technical systems or business management. It was about the difference between moving forward and simply discarding what came before. Real progress builds on existing knowledge, improving and adapting rather than starting over. And sometimes, the people who seem easiest to replace are the ones whose absence reveals just how much they were actually contributing.